This is replacement. Old. Ignition. It's froze over. Yeah, and I got this thing balls up on the truck.
That's awesome.
April 9th, the meeting of the Sherwood Planning Commission will please come to order. Please call the roll.
Gillum.
Here.
Knight.
Here.
Martin.
Here.
Middleton.
Here.
Bruno.
Here. You've all received a copy of the minutes of the March meeting. Are there any corrections, additions?
Motion to approve. Second.
We have a motion and a second.
Gillum.
Aye.
Knight.
Aye.
Martin.
Aye.
Middleton.
Aye.
Bruno.
Aye.
On the agenda, we're going to add a couple of items under new business. One will be a final plat for Phase 6A of Trammell Estate. Second one will be a brief discussion of Act 446 that was recently passed by the General Assembly. And the third will be a status update on the small cells legislation that's currently in the General Assembly. Are there any other additions? It will go as stand. Item number 5.
Proposed revisions to Chapter 14 of the Zoning Code concerning the appeals process.
Kevin.
Everybody hear me okay?
Yep.
All right.
Yes, sir.
So in the materials that the commission was sent by staff in regards to this item, you should have received a draft copy of the document that contains revised language to essentially section 1414, subsections 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and I believe it extends into 7 as well. I have a red line version, which is hard to read after you go through a couple of track change iterations. Has the commission had time to read this and digest it? At this point, I choose not to make a presentation by reading all the changes over and over again, but if we want to start anywhere within the document you all have, I'd be happy to discuss it. But I will begin by saying that this is in response to the city's need and the staff's need to have a formalized Board of Zoning Adjustments process that was a lot more clear about process. And as it stood before, there was a lot of in-between reading, so maybe some in-between reading that one would have to occur, but it wasn't articulated. And I think the language that's in there now is a lot clearer. There's a lot more inclusivity in terms of how you go through that formalized process. So aside from that, I will happily entertain any questions or any comments that the commission has with regard to the proposed change.
Is there any difference between the document that was in the packet versus the one that was laying here, given to us tonight?
No.
Okay.
There is one very small change, and this was brought up to me because I'm not sure that it's necessary to have. I think it's on page 1 where it says oaths, administration of oath. It had oaths, and I removed the S, but in actuality, I think there's discussion about not needing to administer an oath at all. So that could struck as well. But that is fairly benign with respect to the regular subsection 1414.02 under organization.
My recollection at the last meeting was that we discussed that there was no state law that required the oath, but your general sense was it was a good thing to have. So it was left in.
Mm-hmm. So in the version you have, it is left in as administer oath, but it could be struck if the commission felt it prudent or not.
Do you have any other questions? Well, in order to continue with this, we at first need to have a public hearing and hear from the public. So I will now open a public hearing for comments and questions about the draft changes to the Board of Zoning Adjustments section of the zoning code. Anybody wish to make a statement? Hearing none, I call the public hearing closed.
My name is Natalie Brown. I live at 9105 Jacksonville Cato Road. My concern is that no one other than yourselves has even seen the proposed changes in the draft. Well, I know that, but my concern, I understand it's not about Cato Road, but no, I understand that. My understanding is that you've made a proposal here. It's been given to the commission, but no one in the city that might be concerned has been notified about what might be in the draft. Does that not concern anyone?
Was that not part of what was in the draft agenda?
I mean, I understand that it says proposed revisions to Chapter 14, but has the proposed revisions been sent out to anyone? Was anyone allowed to review? The proposed changes were?
Yes.
Where people could access those? Okay, that would be my only concern, to ensure that people could access those proposed revisions. Thank you.
It was also in the paper.
Thank you.
We are at the point of deciding whether we want to think about this some more or pass it on to the city council.
Motion we pass it on.
Second.
We have a motion and a second.
Gillum?
Aye.
Aye.
Martin?
Aye. Aye.
Aye. I do have one question. Published in the paper, what paper do we ordinarily use? Okay.
Yeah.
Council resolution on public works rezone request at 9121 Jacksonville Cato.
Okay, moving on to the next agenda item. This is under old business. As most of you are aware, this from its current R1 to allow for a public works facility, which would essentially be a replacement facility for the existing structure and the existing facility located at 6500 North Hills Boulevard. That site, according to the Public Works Director, is outgrowing itself. The city is obviously growing, and it needs a longer-term facility where it can house its existing operations and potentially house future operations. Not exactly sure what the time period would be for this use, but I'm thinking based on longevity purposes, this would be a 15 to 25 year at minimum move for the city to be able to grow its public works operations. So as you can see in your report, there's a comparison graphic, both aerials as well as land use classifications for the existing operation. Was the site of request for rezoning. You will know the city council passed resolution, which you all have access to, that essentially says we want a classification, as it will, or some way to facilitate this use, because the city council does want this use at this site. However, they want it so that they can regulate it, essentially, under the zoning code as a conditional use. So that's essentially what the resolution says. So to accommodate the resolution, I have taken a crack, if you will, at inserting some proposed language. Your report gets into some things I'm not going to read from the report in terms of background, existing conditions. I will make a note here. There's a couple of things I wanted to make sure that everyone, for the record, my report speaks to city zoning and selected regulations. You see in your use chart that's a public utility, but it doesn't regulate or disowned works facilities, and that's the distinguishment that I'm trying to make a distinction from, because public utilities can be municipally owned, but public utilities can also be owned privately, whereas municipally owned facilities can be distinguished and separate, and in this case, probably be controlled a bit more than a quote, public utility. So that's why the language reads the way it does, and it's alphabetical. So municipally owned would be in the M's, not necessarily in the P's where you see public utility. But it would be administered basically in the same way that you would have as a conditional use. It would have to come before this board, and then it would still have to go before council in order to have a conditional use granted. And that is all before it would even go through staff as a large-scale development where additional buffering, additional exactions would have to come back before this board yet again. So to have the use, but also regulate in terms of its potential impacts on the surrounding land use. If you look at the page, looks like it, last page, you can see where I inserted it as a conditional use in R1 only. I did not put this specific type of use as a conditional use R2 or 3, simply because those zones you tend to get a little bit too close for comfort. This is something that the board can obviously discuss. This is something that you see with public utilities as conditional use. Those are conditional R2, other residential zones, where I elected to not have it as other residential zones. I kept it in R1. Bring that up as a potential discussion point if the board saw fit. That is all I have on this. If anyone has.
Can you amplify on why you specifically didn't bring it up in any
this, like the one at 60, they're pretty land intense, and I'm not familiar enough with the makeup of other opportunity sites that would house this type of use in an R2 or an R3 or an R4. But I know in R1 you will have a little more open acreage that also allows you an opportunity to buffer that use from adjacent uses. So you end up having a little more room to play in R1. But I will, in full disclosure, my first cut at this, I actually had the C or R2, or I had the others as well. But for discussionary purpose, I just left it in as a conditional use R1, and I'm bringing it up now to help have this discussion.
I noticed in your report that you went to section 140210B, uses exclusively conditional, and I wondered why you didn't want to pursue that.
That is, I think, a qualifier to the things in your use chart, because section 140210B provides you a little bit more emphasis on how you would use the use chart. If you want to add public works facility, use is exclusively conditional as a sub-item, that is certainly possible. That allows for even greater specificity and control on the use. So that is not falling deaf on me. I think that's actually a good idea. But this doesn't, in my view, Mr. Cobb can, but the things that are used as exclusively conditional doesn't necessarily preclude one from using the use chart. But Mr. Cobb can different. It needs to be specified in 140210.
I think you made one good point that I really agree with when you said that it's not a good idea to create a separate zoning classification for something like this, because unless it's a conditional use, and the use isn't done, or the actual activities that were proposed aren't done, it's hard to unchange a rezone. Whereas a conditional use, if it doesn't go exactly precisely the way the conditional use specified, it's canceled out, doesn't exist. It reverts back to what it was.
That's why the land use and police power of conditional use.
But just play devil's advocate. I like the language in the section uses exclusively conditional. Certain uses, due to their public, quasi-public nature and their potentially deleterious impact on adjacent properties, are not applicable by right in any zoning classification except industrial. And that sounds kind of like what we're looking at here. Thing is, can this be structured that similar uses, which might want to locate somewhere else in the city, would have to also have special language in order to permit them? Or would it be better to craft it on the front end and say it can be anywhere, but there's special conditions?
I think in this particular instance, you're dealing with a situation where you have a specific site already purchased, you have a specific use for that site. So it is so focused and so narrow, you could front load it, but as long as it's regulated under the conditions permit part, I think safeguards are still there as a city. I think the intent is to safeguard potential impacts on the surrounding. I don't know that that's going to make or break the ability for the city to impose actions on the plaintiff. Help mitigate claims. But like I said before, I agree with you that sub-item E, were one, wanted to separate utility storage yards from public works facilities. Public works facilities can be ubiquitous in their own right. This one happens to be multifaceted. I mean, like, you have public works facilities that are also very narrow in scope and use that wouldn't fit this level of intensity. And so that just that use of that word public works can be a lot of different.
So you're essentially recommending narrowing the scope.
Yes. Not creating a zoning classification, but narrowing the scope on the conditional use chart. There is a very, very specific use, very, very specific need that happens to be simply.
Would you do more than simply add a C in the use chart?
Are you saying something else besides
in the section on in the R1 zoning classification under the list of conditional uses? And one of the things that was concerning folks, other than just that the site plan is what the difference maker. How that's done and how it mitigates any adverse impacts on surrounding properties is where the rubber meets the road. Now the question is, should there be some specific language on this particular conditional use that mandates some conditions for approving it?
You could do it in the code, and it could be that specific to that use as a subparagraph. Say, for the purposes of this section, public works facilities that are municipally owned shall be regulated in the following manner, or shall meet this letter of intent, and then you can spell out the thing you'd like to impose on that particular use, whether it's buffering, whether it's hours of operation. I don't know a tremendous amount about the hours of operation site, so I would refrain from getting specific code before you know a little bit more about how the operation is. If the public works director were here, I'm sure he would provide you.
He's here.
Say that just to prod the conversation.
You're learning.
So I think that conversation is a good one to have to understand that truly what the operations part of this thing would entail at the proposed site, because I wouldn't be able to stand up here, but there's somebody to my right that very well.
Well, unless something's changed, and Brian, Mr. Galloway can correct me, it's 7 to 3:30 Monday to Friday. except in the case of an emergency. Mm-hmm. Inclement weather.
What'd you say the hours were?
7 a.m. to 3:30 in the afternoon. The majority of the time. In the summertime, when it gets hot, we adjust the hours of the spring drainage roads at 6 a.m. to 2:30. Get them back in. Beat some of the heat.
And as sort of if you wanted to have, we're dealing with site-specific impact. We haven't seen the site plan, know what that would yet. But this board, this commission, would have a review after it goes through the process for intake and review at the staff level, obviously. And in terms of the letter and of regulations, all can have the power to impose further exactions, further, call them impact mitigators based on what you see on the ground. Mm-hmm. Getting to that level of detail in language in code, you could do it, but it may not get used. Because you don't know what you're going to get. You can do it.
Well, I think at a minimum, if we're going to go with R1 uniquely, then it needs to be in the list of conditional uses in the R1 zone section as well as the use chart. And I think we need to avoid this for specific use, because once that's put in there, that's available in 80% of the city, because 80% of the cities are R1. So we need to get that wording right.
So in lieu of having it as an inserted item in the use table, you would have it as...
I'd say both.
You would have some language in R1, uses strictly conditional, specify public works facility, and further language that regulates how you want to regulate them?
Not necessarily. That's a discussion I think we need to have as to how far we want to go to spell out what the use has to protect.
Not necessarily a bad thing. I just want to be clear.
I think just at the minimum, the use must be listed as a conditional use in both places.
And I had looked at that. I chose not to insert the language. A lot of times I do that just to see what our discussion out of the form that we're at now.
Gentlemen, what's your thinking? I mean, we're not at a point to approve anything because I haven't seen language, but do you have concerns, suggestions, observations?
We're going on the right track, getting all this part of the code, but if it comes down to the limiting of this facility, do that further on down forward.
So just to be clear, section 1402 ND, you would want a separate sub-item E that speaks to public works facilities display. So that lumped into the larger conversation about certain uses due to their public or quasi-public nature.
What section did you say?
14210B. This is under
B.
B. Use is exclusively conditional.
No. I'm talking about 140401 in the R1 section, because there are a list, 6 items that are eligible conditional uses, and I think there needs to be a 7th.
Top of page 3 of...
To the extent that we're limiting this just to R1 and not opening it up for the other zoning districts.
Yeah, you can see in sub-item 3, public utility buildings. I remember when this first came in on the zoning project, I looked at public utility buildings. I was sort of dissecting that language. I think that truly is distinct from what we're talking about.
Well, I suggest looking at 2 possibilities. One, that was a limiting factor, and that's why we couldn't use it. So you got 2 options here in my mind, and one is to change the wording of the existing conditional use limitation, and the other is to add one. So we will wait on your recommendation. Any other advice to our consultant?
When's the council?
It's the fourth Monday. And depending on what we think is a good idea, we will then have to hold a public hearing. So we're a month away anyway. And my sense is that when we've looked at the next draft at the next meeting, at that point we can schedule a hearing if we're comfortable with going forward. Okay.
All right, the next item on the agenda under old business is accessory structures. So there's a section in our table, it's a setback table, it's 141009. City has administratively wanted to begin clarifying their process of being able to exempt the setback chart that you see for accessory structures. And some of the proposed changes that you have before you, all it does is add an exemption that says Planning Commission shall have the authority to reduce side and rear yard setbacks to a minimum of 5 feet if it can be demonstrated that it's not going to be detrimental to public welfare. So it's essentially allowing staff to not have to bring this to a full variance and then, of course, go before the Board of Zoning Adjustments, which we're also looking to amend, but provides the city with a little bit of latitude because they see a lot of accessory buildings that, so as long as they can administrate like they should be afforded that opportunity regulation. So the language you have before you, there was a version that I had put out before I had some of the institutional knowledge that I now have from the city regarding Board of Zoning Adjustments, and that administratively, I don't think anybody wants every single one of them to go before a full BZA hearing, and right now there isn't a quasi-judicial, quote, administrative zoning process. This essentially would be a formative administrative zoning. We wouldn't call it that. We call it an exemption. Simply call it an administrative exemption, and as long as the parameters were met, wouldn't have to go before the Planning Commission. It would not have to go before any sort of quasi-judicial board. Well, it says exception. We can talk about language and is it an exemption or is it an exception? I would say it's an exemption. You're being exempt from the rules. There's a lot of exception in the regulations, but I think these are exemption.
Well, I think Andy wants to talk, but my question is, what's the problem to be solved?
This would require some more staff insight, sir.
Andy?
And by that, you mean, why do we need to amend it at all? What problem are we solving? In y'all's package, we had a draft copy that I made that showed the existing language. And whatever digital age, I guess, is we've got our zoning code online now, and in an attempt to reduce the request for variances for accessory structures altogether, we worked hard on this and came up with just a whole new program. And I will say this, it's really worked, because how many accessory structure variances are we getting these days? Zip, for the most part. That's not to say they're not going to happen. But what happens all the time now, and literally, I don't want to be exaggerating, but I would say probably about 3 times a week, I'm getting a call or I'm returning a message from that was taken by one of the clerks in the permit office that somebody that has some question about the setbacks about an accessory structure. And I used to would field those calls just off the top of my head. Not since we did this, because it's good to have this chart in front of you when you answer those questions to keep everything straight. And so typically what I'll do is I'll call the citizen back, and usually right off the bat I'll say, "Are you in front of a computer? Or can you get in front of a computer?" Usually they can, and I'll walk them to the City of Sherwood website and take them to the zoning code and have them open it up. And anyway, get them to click on this page of our zoning code that deals with this subject matter. And then I'll just kind of review this ordinance with them, okay? And what I have found out is that when I get to paragraph E, and one thing I want to say is I deal with code books all the time, with building code, plumbing code, electrical code, and all that. And typically any exceptions follow the rule, and it's not the other way around. And one of the things that's awkward about going over this with people, and you run into this paragraph about setbacks shall be governed by the following chart, and then it says the planning commission shall have the authority to reduce these setback requirements if it can be demonstrated that such action will welfare. Such action shall not be considered and reviewed as a variance. No setback reduction shall be allowed which decreases the required setback to less than 5 feet. Okay? And sometimes you get a question about what those sentences mean. And I would rather go over anyway, in the sequence of things, I would rather go to the chart first to answer the specific questions do they have. And I think a lot of times you find out during that process, that's all they needed to know. They're good with that. Oh, okay, 8 feet for me, what I'm trying to do here. No problem. You're done. You don't have to talk anymore. Okay? So I would like it that if the exception or exemption or whatever we call it, that follow the chart. And that's one of the changes that we're making, and it's just for the ease of conversation. Okay, the other thing that we're doing is we've got a sentence in here that says such action shall not be considered and reviewed as a variance. And what we really need to know is what it is going to be considered as. Okay, and it doesn't matter to me if we call it an exception or an exemption. Now, if it's going to continue to be a function of the Board of Adjustments particularly, I think we should call it an exception because that's already set up in our language for other things. In the duties of the Board of Adjustments and things like that, we already have several exceptions in there, and that would just be one we could add to that list, for example. More importantly, we don't need to say it's not being reviewed as a variance. I mean, we don't need to say that about anything that we're talking about that's not going to be considered a variance because it's kind of extraneous. And the fact of the matter is, there are situations where somebody may be applying for reduced setbacks for an accessory structures as a variance. And I'll give you, just an example probably everybody's familiar with. And I'm going to use the language from the new appeals process amendment. We just voted to amend that. Is that correct? Okay, so we got a little bit of new language here. In hearing for a variance, it says establishing uniqueness for particular property under consideration, including but is not limited to the following criteria: orientation, narrowness, shallowness, irregularity, depth, topographical conditions, and shape. Okay? Well, if you'll drive down Oakbrook here, when you get into kind of the newer houses, not the older part of Oakbrook, but you first get to Hickory Ridge, y'all probably have all noticed that there's a new house there, and they've got a fence that kind of comes out pretty far to the street, and they've got a storage building in their front yard setback inside of their fence. Well, that gentleman that bought that new house from Danny McGill came to the Board of Adjustments and applied for a variance to extend his fence out, and then later applied for a variance to put his storage building there. And the reason was, if you look at that lot about 8 foot behind his house, it goes like that. And there's a lot of lots over there that have it sold right now because they're so steep, they're unbuildable. And so it's likely that because of topographical conditions, we may want to grant some variances so people can develop those lots one day. You know, but there are cases where that somebody might want to apply for exceptions to the setbacks, even on accessory structures, as a variance because it's warranted. The focus, though, is so we can say what it is instead of saying what it isn't. You know, if somebody, wants to pursue that opportunity, they're just like, look, I'm trying to build a double garage. I've already got a driveway that goes up the side of my house, and to push it over 8 feet is really going to cause a hardship. You know, we can start asking questions like, well, if it's an 8-foot sidewall height, and you've only got like a 612 pitch and you're doing a hip roof, it's not going to have that looming factor is what we're trying to avoid here. And so maybe we can look at that and make an exception. Or like I said, if it's called an exemption, that's okay with me. I think kind of in the latter part of the first round of, quite a few discussions on this. We went through several meetings on this, but at one point before this got adopted, it was floated to me that we might make those exemptions on a staff level the same way we do fences on corners. And I'm the one who said, I don't want that. Okay? It was like it was being offered to me. I said, no, because, I kind of like it that they have to really go through a long process. It's not just a matter of me coming back to the office and checking with Richard and giving them a decision the next day, because it thwarts a whole lot of that. You'd be surprised how many people decide they can live with the setbacks that we have, as opposed to like putting their project off for 2 months, or and sometimes they just think, really, a lot of times it just gives them a chance to think about it, and they'll call back, no, we've decided just to go ahead. Because, after giving it a little thought, it doesn't matter to them. So, but the real purpose is trying to solve, it streamlines that paragraph. It's a better worded paragraph, the way he has it. It's just a sentence that says what 3 or 4 sentences say. That's always better. We're actually calling what it is and not what it isn't, and we're putting it as, following the table is where its proper place is.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I agree that the sentence by saying that it's not a variance is probably unnecessary. And my sense is that it was an overreaction to what had been going on, where a lot of things were coming to the Board of Zoning Adjustment that weren't not variances, and this is kind of an overreaction to it. I'll ask anybody, what zoning districts does this apply to?
R1 for the very most part that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about accessory structures and all.
Chart 1410 deals with lots, the smallest half-acre lot. Nothing too many of those. We have half-acre or similar, half-acre to less than 1 acre, and then lots 1 acre.
I'm sorry, I don't have a copy of the zoning code in front of me. If somebody does, what we need to just reference is that ordinance used to just deal with residential property.
Well, I checked it, and that whole section, there's only one sentence in there that says residential, and it doesn't apply to anything else but that one sentence. And so technically, you could argue that this applies to the whole thing. And all I'm saying is that's something that needs to be discussed to decide if some wording needs to specify that, because there can be accessory structures anywhere, and the question is, do we want these same standards in commercial and industrial?
We don't.
And so that's an issue. Second issue is that, as you recall, what brought this all ahead was that it was the Board of Zoning Adjustment that was considering variances. Well, there's a section in the code right now, 140208, when authorized by the Board of Zoning Adjustment, zoning height limitations may be extended, which in effect overrides this. So there's a couple of conflicts here that need to be addressed as we're going through this. And finally, it doesn't make sense to me, just to me, to have the Planning Commission be able to authorize a setback to a minimum of 5 feet when there are 3 on this chart that are 4 feet. In my mind, 5 feet is better across the board. And anybody that's interested, I'll explain why. But those are a couple of things that I think need to be thought through. As one of the things we're finding an issue with the current zoning is that there's conflicts built in a couple of places. We just need to make sure that we get rid of those. Okay, Kevin? Any other thoughts? I think you need to take a look at that 140208. And I will tell you that, in my opinion, the Board of Zoning Adjustment is a very unique body authorized by state statute, and it has 2 assignments, appeals and variances. And there are about half a dozen things that our ordinance puts on the Board of Zoning Adjustment that I question should be there. And throwing height exceptions out to the board is one I don't think makes sense. I mean, if we have a standard, at least for residential, about how tall we're willing to let things go, then it needs to specify that and stay there. And but I basically like the idea. These are the requirements. You can make a case for an exception, but there's got to be some standard by which that case is made, whether it's by staff or by this body. And I'm okay. It's kind of general when it says will not result in undue negative impacts. Well, okay, as long as you can document that.
For what it's worth, I will say this, we have had a long history up here of trying to amend, Lucian's been involved in this for over a decade, of trying to amend our accessory structure ordinance to allow our citizens more freedom to enjoy their property and build larger structures than what our former ordinances allowed. And this was a huge adjustment change that I feel like was long coming, due to the fact, we got Gravel Ridge and a lot more rural type property and, just a whole conglomeration of things. And some of the decisions we make when we know we're going to take that to the city council is we're still trying to get something sold. Okay. So that being said, this has been so successful at stemming variances that I personally am a lot more comfortable assuming the responsibility of deciding on those adjustments, or whatever we call them, whatever the name we come up with to call them, exceptions, exemptions, or whatever. I'm comfortable doing that on a staff level like we do fences. Anytime I have something like that, I typically always go to Richard now, used to be Ellen, but we talk about it together to make sure I'm not missing something, they're not missing something, and then we make a decision. So, thank you.
Thank you. Kevin, I hope this gives you enough information to come back at us with a recommendation. Thanks. Under new business, Richard, final plat for Phase 6A Trammell Estates.
Yes, Trammell Estates Phase 6 was a preliminary plat that was reviewed and approved, and then construction plans were reviewed and approved. It has been constructed to some level of completion in all of Phase 6, but because of the weather and a lot of delays and problems, recently, there is a portion of it which is delineated as 6A, which is basically half the number of houses in that whole Phase 6. And 6A is the part that was buildable, constructible with the weather that we've had. It's been reviewed, it's been inspected, and it's been signed off on as being complete on the part that's drawn as a 6B. So that we're basically just cutting that into two phases, A and B, for that one preliminary plat that was already approved. I don't see any problems with it. Mr. Rick Ferguson is the developer. He asked me, he's brought it in. He's been in 2 or 3 days in a row. We've been making sure everything is correct. And he asked if he needed to be here tonight to express his sincerity to the Planning Commission about, wanting to move ahead with this so that we could get these lots on the market and make them available, because it's a certain market demographic or a price range that these lots fill that need in the market. And I advised him, I think this is very straightforward, and I advised him that I didn't think it was necessary for him to be here. So my only request is that you can authorize Mr. Middleton to sign the 6A part, and then when 6B comes in, it'll be the same request again here in front of you. Is there anything you need to know? Pardon me.
They are totally separate?
They're not totally separable. They are separate, but they're not separable to the extent that the sidewalk that is drawn on there now goes to a point and stops, but it'll be picked up and carried on into 6B. So yes, they're separate as far as filing them out and being able to go to market.
We're not changing the limits of the preliminary plat. We're just basically filing it in 2 pieces instead of one.
That's correct.
Whole one. Okay.
Any other questions? Or motion?
Second.
Have a motion and a second to approve the final plat.
Gillum.
Aye.
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 Martin.
Aye.
Middleton.
Aye.
Bruno.
Aye.
And may I add that the bill of assurance for this specifies 6A.
Next item is Act 446. It was passed by the General Assembly. It was Senate Bill 170. This was basically what it does is it tells municipalities and counties that they cannot regulate the building design of any structure. Now, there's a series of things that they cannot do. They can't regulate building color. Can't regulate the type or style of exterior cladding material, style or materials of rough structures, pitches, or porches, architectural ornamentation, location, design, placement, or architectural styling of windows and doors, including garage doors, number and types of rooms, interior layout of rooms, square footage of structure, and that's the one that gets us. There may be some other issues if we look deeper, but right now in R1, we require a minimum of 1,000 square feet heated and cooled. In R2, we require 800. As soon as this act becomes effective, those are out the window. So at some point, we probably just need to amend that so that we're in compliance with state law. What happened, my understanding, is that some areas in northwest Arkansas overregulated to the extent that they were crowding small houses in particular out of the market, and it upset some developers and one or two legislators who happened to be clients of developers. And so this got passed, and it's a kind of part of an reaction to overregulation. I mean, nobody likes overregulation. There are some exceptions in here. If it's a historic district, National Register, floodplains, and things like that. But as far as I can tell so far, the only thing that affects are those minimum size of structures in our ordinance.
How does that affect the developer that's say the area right across Oakland there where there's certain
doesn't affect them at all. One of the exceptions is that a developer with a bill of assurance, they can do what they want to, as long as it meets other requirements of the city. But if they want to make them smaller or do something with design, they can.
So it's another brother on the block.
Mostly it's what the city can or cannot regulate.
Based on somebody got angry or started.
Well, maybe.
Mr. Middleton, and a point you just made, just a clarification, is that staff would not be involved in reviewing the size, if there is a size restriction in a bill of assurance or by the developer, that would be something that the developer and the property owners association, someone other than us, would regulate. We wouldn't have an opportunity to review it.
And the final item is an update, if you would, Mr. Cobb, on the small cell legislation.
The parties involved with respect to getting this legislation reviewed started in the Senate, but then as the session has gone on, there was a concern that perhaps they were going to run out of legislative time. So one was filed, an identical bill was filed on the House side, and so they've been kind of going like this. And my understanding is that they've been approved and they're headed to the governor's desk. It does not have an emergency clause, so there will be some period of time before it will actually be law. My initial understanding of how this is going to impact us in terms of what we can do is one of three things. The city can do nothing with respect to trying to add any ordinance controls to the existing state law. It can do nothing to build on that. That's one option, and just go with the straight bill, the state act, which sets out what utilities, or rather what municipalities can and can't do, rights of way, how we have to treat rights of way, how quickly we have to act on permit applications. All of that is contained in the document, what fees we can charge, what have you. Municipalities are given two other options, though. Option two, if you will, is what I'm going to call an aesthetic option. And that would have to be something that would be drafted and passed by the city in the form of an ordinance that would have some limitations on design and style of these small cell structures. Bear in mind, though, that it can't be more than what's granted in terms of the state which is pretty draconian about what cities can do, but it's something that we may or may not want to consider. The second, or rather the third option for a municipality is a consideration of attachment of small cell facilities to existing poles, which wouldn't affect us probably very much in terms of utility poles because we really don't own any of those. Those are North Little Rock or First Electric. But there is a question about poles that where we have traffic signals mounted and whether or not those would be appropriate for the addition of small cell. And if we deem that it would be appropriate in some places, then we'll need to write some regulations about that. But that's where we are.
Basically, the state legislation is pretty much a mirror of the FCC order, with one exception. The FCC order said that if a city took longer than 60 or 90 days, depending on the shot clock, that they were considered to not have made a decision. And at that point, they would get an expedited court review. And the predominance of the evidence would be that the utilities had the right to do it. What the state law says is if you don't make a decision within that 60 or 90 days, it's considered approved. But that's the major difference. And like counsel said, well, I guess my reaction is we probably ought to pull the draft that we sent up to the council before because it's different and there's some things that were in that we probably can't do. I mean, basically what the law says is you must allow them to put it in your right of way, period, in the paragraph. And the exception was if you have some aesthetic standards, which we don't have. The only thing that I think that we had in our original package was that we wanted to change the subdivision regulations to start undergrounding everything we could. And we still may want to do that. And that obviously doesn't have a bearing on antennas, but it would on the wiring. So it's kind of where we're at right now. But I do think we need to pull it and decide what we want to do next.
And as far as, attaching to a traffic signal pole, I know there's Mr. Gillums and registered engineer just like I am. Those traffic signal poles have been stamped by a registered engineer without that being designed as a wind load or a load on them. So if something ever happens, I think to allow them, you're gonna have to have somebody stamp it or go back to the engineer record on the pole and the foundation, because they've both been stamped by two different engineers.
And Richard, we've gotten some requests already, haven't we?
Yes, we have, and we've simply held up as much as we can on them till we get clarification on what to do.
We're waiting to see. I'm going to recommend that even though if this bill is signed off on by the governor and it's not, it's 90 days before it's actually valid. I still think it ought to be the blueprint that we look to start looking at some of these applications now, because that I doubt very seriously there will be a court challenge. And Tracy has 5 or 6, I think.
I have issued address. I've had requests for addressing because those facilities do have unique addresses because of the electrical supplies. Mm-hmm. And I've issued one address for a small cell, and I have 8 in the queue right now that I have not issued, but I have them. I have the request in front of me.
Brian?
Yes, I'm Brian Galloway, Public Works Director. One of my big concerns that I think we should really consider would be commingling the wiring, through the center of these poles with our wiring. It would make it virtually impossible for us to repull wires if you just give somebody free rein to pull whatever they want up through the middle of that pole. There would be a lot of way to fix a conduit, as Blake said, Mr. Martin said, to the outside of that aluminum pole. It's something we really ought to consider. It would make maintenance just we have not given it that. Okay. I just wanted that to be considered.
I think the areas where we do have an interest is undoubtedly there's going to be wiring to whatever poles that are already in place if they're not co-locating. And we do have an interest in what happens digging up the right-of-way and traffic control and all of that. But we'd have that interest anyway.
And there would be some probably greater risk to the traffic light, to the electronics of the traffic control with antennas and things such as that.
It'd be real interesting to find out what our light's going to do with theirs.
As another note, that is the one small cell that is landed on the ground is in state highway right of way, and that one is one that we have a fairly well delineated relationship with the Department of Transportation. It's basically, we don't we don't comment on their stuff.
That's all we have for the agenda. A motion to adjourn?
Yes, sir. Make that motion.
Second.
Gillum?
Aye.
Knight?
Aye.
Martin?
Aye.
Middleton?
Aye.
Bruno?
Aye.
Call the April 9th meeting of the Sherwood Board of Zoning Adjustment to order. Roll call.
Gillum?
Here.
Knight?
Here.
Martin?
Here.
Middleton?
Here.
Bruno?
Here.
You've received copies of the minutes of the last board meeting. Are there any corrections or additions?
Motion to approve.
Second.
Gillum?
Aye.
Knight?
Aye.
Martin?
Aye.
Middleton?
Aye.
Bruno?
Aye.
There is nothing on the agenda to approve. Is there anything you wish to add?
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
Gillum,
Aye.
Knight,
Aye.
Martin,
Aye.
Middleton,
Aye.
Bruno.
Aye.